The old rule remains the case that you've got to master the form before you can break it. It's no good just coming along as a sort of amateur songwriter, thinking you can throw in as many words in a line as you like. Dylan has mastered all these demands of economy and concentration and all that. And then he can break free of it.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Find the podcast online at bookedonrock.com. You can find every episode there, along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Author Michael Gray is this episode's guest. He's here to talk about the brand new 3-part 50th anniversary edition of his highly acclaimed book, Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan. The first edition of Song and Dance Man was the first book to seriously examine the work of Bob Dylan, originating in the realm of scholarship, put Dylan on the road to the Nobel Prize. 50 years and hundreds of Dylan books later, many still consider it one of the very best. Rolling Stone called it monumental, endlessly illuminating. The original Song and Dance Man was released in 1972, and it covered Dylan's work through 1970's self-portrait, but it was expanded in a new edition in 1982 and again in 2000, growing to over 900 pages and covering Dylan's work through 1997's Time Out of Mind. But Song and Dance Man has been out of print for over a decade, during which time Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize for Literature, continued delivering critically lauded records, and earned a new generation of fans while sustaining older ones in his 7th decade as an artist. The 50th anniversary series puts every word of Song and Dance Man back into print, but in an accessible 3-volume format. And Michael Gray is here to tell us about what's inside those 3 volumes. A playlist of the songs we discuss in this episode can be found on the show notes page. Michael Gray, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast.
Thank you.
Before I ask you about this beautifully arranged 3-volume 50th anniversary edition, can you take us back to the original book from 1972, titled Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan? This was the first critical study of Dylan's work. What was it about his work that connected with you, so much so that you decided to write the original book?
First of all, words, because, I didn't grow up on folk music. I grew up on rock and roll. And for me, rock and roll was a marvelous antidote to the kind of uptight sort of school that I went to. So it was greatly liberating. But I was also very good at English. I liked books. I liked reading. And when I got to university, which was at the end of 1964, which was a great time to become a university student, because the 1960s was just exploding. And I was being trained to scrutinize English literature texts, 19th century novels, the Romantic poets. Particularly, I liked close to the text analysis, that was the phrase, where you really looked at why a particular sentence used those particular words. And the most admirable people were the ones who were the most concise. If you think of someone like Charles Dickens, he's obviously popularly thought to be very long-winded and, huge books with blah, 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 blah. But actually, there are many, many paragraphs in his work where any modern writer would take 5 times as long to say the same thing. Very, very concentrated use of language sometimes. And it seemed to me that when I first heard Bob Dylan, there was something about, first of all, he was writing very long songs. This was the mid-60s. He was just going electric, as it was called. And he was unlike anybody else I'd ever heard. I was used to simple songs with exciting music. And here was somebody who, in the acoustic work, seemed to be more or less stripping music away altogether and just emphasizing words. And then next minute, what do you know? There's Subterranean Homesick Blues. And this was amazing to me. It was also he astonished me because every time he made a record, he sounded completely different. Not only was the music different, but the voice too, you know. He was like a ventriloquist. I mean, he had all these voices, whereas most people have one. You know, Elvis had a couple because he had an beautiful early hillbilly voice. And then he got stuck in a kind of voice. And so, you know, and then because the songs seemed so long and complicated and interesting, I started really wanting to look into those. And my natural inclination was to look at words. And so that's how it started. And then I found that, you know, he was being treated as either a sort of folky or as a pop star, because now suddenly he was groovy and was wearing Chelsea boots and, you know, had singles in the hit parade. And what nobody was treating him as was any kind of a serious artist. And it seemed to me that maybe he was. And in the course of exploring that, you know, the process of studying someone is a process whereby you, whether what you thought was there really is there or not. And I found that it really was. I also found that, you know, unlike most people on the radio or in popular music of any kind, he was obviously very well read. You know, there are references to work by other people, and he name checks a lot of writers and poets and so on. So altogether, this was really the prompt to carrying on. Yeah, I just needed to write about him at length. And so it turned into a book, because what else could you do? I'm far too old to be trying to catch up with what Bob Dylan has done in the 21st century. I mean, I did do another book published in 2006 and 8, the Bob Dylan Encyclopedia. And that does at least cover things like the Love and Theft album of 2001. It still seems to me to be the one really great album, Bob Dylan album of the 21st century. Better than Rough and Rowdy Ways, and certainly better than, you know, Tempest. And I thought Modern Times was like Love and Theft Light.
Murder Most Foul, when I heard that, I thought Dylan still has that effect on me. Murder Most Foul. I was mesmerized by that song.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary piece of work, and extraordinary time to throw it out, of course. Very brilliant timing, if you want to look at it that way. Some of the writing within that long track, the stuff where you're inside John F. Kennedy's head and he's being rushed to the hospital, that's extraordinary creative writing.
Trying to think of the one verse that really gets me is, boy, was it sitting next to my wife? It was something alluding to just 1 minute, my wife is sitting to the left of me, and the next minute I'm being rushed to the hospital. And it was just so beautifully written. And what you had just mentioned, it was concise, concentrated. It's like just the emotion in the fewest words. By the way, I found the lyric, riding in the back seat next to my wife, heading straight on into the afterlife. Oof, that got me. Yeah.
Yes.
Man. Yeah, it gave me chills. So Volume 1 explores the ways that Dylan's early writing relates to folk music, blues, rock, and mainstream literature. He was just 20 years old when his 1962 self-titled debut was released. Only 2 songs are his own, Song to Woody and Talk in New York. The rest are traditional and or old blues songs, and it's an album you know few people liked, and it didn't sell. You say in Volume 1 that, quote, it has such a young Dylan on it that he sounds about 75. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, he's trying to sound like a very old blues man. In March 62, so after he's recorded that album, in March 62, he goes across the river into Brooklyn, and he goes into a studio that is owned by the old blues singer Victoria Spivey. And she's recording an album with 3 people, herself and Roosevelt Sykes and Big Joe Williams. And Big Joe Williams lets Bob play harmonica and sing backup vocals on a version of sitting on top of the world. And at one point, actually, I think 2 points, Big Joe generously stands back from the vocal mic so that the only vocal you hear, just for a line of the chorus, is Bob's. And it's funny because there are these two people with their very different agendas. There's middle-aged Big Joe Williams trying to sound as on the ball and fit and thrusting as possible. And there is this absurdly youthful Bob Dylan trying to sound as old as the hills.
He's developing so quickly. 1963 is The Free Willin' Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
All originals now, Blown in the Wind, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Masters of War. This and the following album, 1964's The Times, They Are A-Changin', contain Dylan's quote-unquote famous protest songs. But you note that Dylan uses cliche in these songs for emphasis. It's more rhetoric than art. Did Dylan not have a trust in his audience early on, or was he still trying to determine just who his audience was since it was still so early in his career?
I don't know. I mean, I try not to decide what Bob is thinking about or
Nobody knows what Bob's thinking.
Exactly. I try to just look at the work itself. And in the end, you know, what I feel is that however charismatic he has been and however interesting his life may or may not have been, in the end, in the final end, to use one of his nice double meanings, tautologies, you would say if they weren't deliberate. In the final end, it's the work that matters. It's the work that resounds around the world. And I know that one of his early friends up north picked up the lyrics of Times They Are Changing and read out the bit about senators, congressmen, please heed the call, and said, what is this shit? And I think that it really didn't take Bob long to realize that that was a pretty wet political thing to be saying. And we moved on to, by the time of Highway 61, we were talking about Dr. Filth, not senators and congressmen.
Yeah, and that's the album you call his first fully fledged Eagle Flight into rock. 1965, that album came out. Blues-based rock and roll. He's grown quite a bit from his rock roots in the mid-60s, and along with the sonic shift is the effect literary culture is having on his contribution. And you did mention this earlier. Talk about the influence major English poets had on Dylan and some of the songs that maybe are a good example of that influence.
Well, I think you can't get away from Shakespeare, and you can't get away from the King James Bible either, whether you want to or not, because it's just the language, the English language is saturated in it. But then I think there are various 19th century people that he liked. Americans too, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson. But one of the people who really stands out for me is Robert Browning, a British poet, who was the master of the dramatic monologue. And Dylan, I think, becomes a new master of the dramatic monologue. That is a song in which you only hear one side of a dialogue, but it's quite clearly a dialogue is going on. And Browning has a thing where he's talking to some critic and saying, you, Sigurdibs, who, 30 years of age, writes statedly for Blackwood's magazine. And you can just hear the sneer in the voice there. And it's exactly paralleled by Bob Dylan with Ballad of a Thin Man. You walk into the room with a pencil in your hand, and so on. You know something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? And then at the end of Subterranean Homesick Blues, we get that verse about don't want to be a bum, better chew gum, the pump don't work because the vandals took the handles. And there's an absolutely parallel use of all those candles, handles, sandals rhymes in one of Browning's poems. It's in the book. I can't quote it verbatim off the top of my head, but it's just so strikingly obvious that he has read Robert Browning. Browning is also there in his 1980s song Blind Willie McTell, because it's Browning who writes God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. And he does it as a series of statements that run backwards. And Dylan parallels this. The whole of Blind Willie McTell is a sort of running backwards through American history. And instead of God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, we get God is in his heaven, and we all want what's his, but power and greed and corruptible seed seem to be all that there is.
And that's a song you highlight. That's one you think highly of. I think that's the one that was not included on the original album, but in later years surfaced.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was only officially released years later on a compilation. Yeah. Yeah. Dylan said he didn't think he sang it right. But then, you know, the artist is never the best judge of their own work. I mean, why should they be? Because like any other listener, what they're very aware of is the conscious part of what they've created. But, you know, if you're a great artist, you're open to the unconscious, to the subconscious, to all that. I've said before, Elvis thought that Old Shep was just as good as That's All Right. He was wrong. And, you know, by the same token, Dylan has often left great songs off his albums. And Blind Willie McTell is certainly one of them.
Springsteen is, I think of Springsteen too. A lot of times he'll just leave a song out because it doesn't fit in with what the overall theme of the album is. But then you listen to it later and you say, boy, this is brilliant.
Yes.
It's interesting to read in Volume 1 about how Dylan shows a vivid growth in the complexity of his use of language. But then by the end of the decade, he begins to pare down and opt for a new simplicity in his writing. Chapters 4 and 5 of Volume 1 chart the two opposite progressions of his artistry. When you think of Dylan's use of language towards complexity, some notable examples that come to mind for you?
Well, just all the sort of supposed the stuff that gets lazily labeled as surrealism. The Tarantula book, songs on Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde, you know, where it's not at all clear who the I or the you or the he or the she is, and where, you know, I mean, jewels and binoculars hang from the head of the mule. I mean, don't ask anybody what that means in terms of, you know, it's not a statement in the same terms as she belongs to me, even if she belongs to me is itself meant ironically. You know, you have to unpick some of that stuff, or you have to let it flow over you and just feel it as the poetry that it is. I remember the first time I saw him live was in May 1966 in Liverpool, when he was doing the first half of his show solo acoustic, and then brought on the people who later became the band for the second half, except Levon Helm wasn't there. And one of the songs he sang in the acoustic half was Visions of Johanna, which had not yet been released in Britain. Blonde on Blonde was not out when he was singing this. So it was the debut of a most amazing song. I mean, a song the like of which you'd never heard in your life before. Nobody had written one like that before. Many verses, 14 lines per verse. And, you know, and in the middle of it, he sings, he sings about the jelly-faced women all sneeze. Hear the one with the mustache say, geez, I can't find my knees. And you know, he was sort of pretty stoned when he was doing those shows, and yet uncannily word perfect. And at the time, he was still teaching people that the same sort of thing that the beat poets had been teaching people. That is that, you know, language did not have to be formal and correct. It could be weird. It could be off the wall without lacking seriousness. And, you know, even though we thought we were so hip at the time, we still basically had on our shoulders the sort of assumptions about what a poem ought to be like. And you could feel people turning around in their seats when they hear this. Geez, I can't find my knees. And you could sort of feel people going, is this still all right? Is this still poetry? You know, so that sort of complexity of language aligned with playfulness, beat poet playfulness, was part of what he brought it to a far, far wider audience than had ever heard it before.
Here's what I am interested in getting your thoughts on, because it's directly after Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands from 66's Blonde on Blonde that, Dylan draws back from the ever-thickening undergrowth of surreal, elusively complex use of language. It's after this that he begins the harder process of paring down towards a new simplicity. It is harder. I mean, some people may think, well, it's easier to pare it down into a new simplicity, but that's not really the case, I don't think. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I agree. I think even in prose, it's often easier to write at length than to pare it down to the bits that matter.
And is Dylan evolving through this process too? Is he starting to say, you know what, I think I need to challenge myself?
I think so, yes. I mean, as I said before, I'm not keen to assume his own motivations on these matters, but yeah, essentially, I think so. And I think John Wesley Harding challenged not only that, but of course also challenged what was happening in rock music, because after Blonde on Blonde, everybody wanted to make a double album. Everybody wanted to do long guitar solos. Not that Bob had done, but, everyone else was doing that. There were groups like Led Zeppelin didn't think it was, they thought singles were this terrible, old-fashioned, commercial, death stuff, that all you could do was express yourself with an album or a double or a triple album. And that kind of rock music was getting increasingly lavish and multi-layered. I mean, when you think back that Sgt. Pepper was achieved on a 4-track machine, it's amazing. But nevertheless, it was a huge sound and a lavish album. And nothing could have cut through all that more incisively than the pared down, biting simplicity of John Wesley Harding. And if that was biting in its simplicity, he didn't stick with that either, because the album after that, Nashville Skyline, was very warm and mellow. I mean, another huge contrast. And the first time I heard that, I was with a friend, and we were just laughing at the outrageousness of Bob singing all these kind of country cliches and singing them so slyly.
John Wesley Harding, that's stripped down to a chilly minimum is how you described it. The most dramatic example of that, you say, is All Along the Watchtower, that surrealism, stripped down to a chilly minimum. And then you mentioned something, you said it's a circular song, All Along the Watchtower.
Yeah, this gets picked up on. I'm not sure how much I'd want to stand by that particular thing. I mean, it depends whether you find it's a ... or a full stop at the end. 2 riders were approaching, and the wind began to howl. Now, does it stop there? Does the wind begin to howl in the sense of, is it going to carry on howling? And then does it flip right back to the beginning after the 2 riders have approached? Do they then have this conversation? There must be some way out of here, said the joker to the thief. Are these the 2 riders? And there was a period when Dylan was still singing that song as a sort of crowd-pleasing encore number, hundreds of times. There was a period where he did end up by re-singing the first verse as the last verse. None of them along the line know what any of it is worth. Full stop. And that became the end of the song. So, it's as circular as you want to think of it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Michael Gray is our guest to talk about the 3-part 50th anniversary series of his book, originally released in 1972, titled Michael Gray's Song and Dance Band, The Art of Bob Dylan. The second volume gets into an interesting period of Dylan's career, the gospel period. That's from 79 through the 80s, one of the periods that continues to fascinate both longtime fans and Curious Listeners is Dylan's religious period. He proclaimed his faith in 3 albums: 1979, Slow Train Coming, 1980, Saved, and 1981, Shot of Love. So this all starts, there was a story of a fan throwing a metal cross on stage mid-November of 1978. I think the media tried to say that that's the moment, but that's not necessarily true.
I don't think so, because I think that tour was the new album when that 1978 tour was happening was Street Legal. And what I'm saying in the book is that there are signs in Street Legal that he is moving away from secular love and seeking for the higher love of God. So it seems to me that the hints are there before someone throws a cross on the stage. I think at the end of the album, there's quite a strong hint that that he hasn't found enough. He's been a married man. He has all these children. He writes all these songs. We better talk this over. And the Street Legal is full of songs of turmoil, and the underlying turmoil there is about what has he got to cling to. But I'm kind of breaking my own rule there by surmising that this is what he's feeling. All I'm really going on is what the songs are saying. But certainly it comes out with a bang when it comes to Slow Train Coming in '79. What I feel about all that, by the way, is of course that we all got very distracted by the lyrics, by the preaching, and therefore, comparatively speaking, failed to notice that this was the Bob Dylan who had explored folk music, who had explored rock and roll, who had explored country music, now exploring another great form of American popular music, black church music, gospel.
There was an interesting comment you made too in the book that I wanted to ask you to explain, because you do note that spiritually Dylan may have arrived around this period, but artistically he was coasting. And there's an interesting quote from the book. You write, quote, "What makes these Born Again albums so flawed and shallow in the context of Bob Dylan's whole catalog is that he has been satisfied on these records to assert and argue and declaim, but he has hardly bothered anywhere on them to fulfill the more important tasks of the artist. He has not created worlds here. He has only argued about them." Can you explain that?
Yeah. Part of me still agrees with that. Part of me thinks that I really under recognize the strengths of the better songs on that record. I mean, the stuff that got me at the time as being arguing instead of creating was the shock of hearing the person who had said, "Don't follow leaders, watch the parking meters," now saying, "There's only one authority, that's the authority on high." That's quite a volte-face. That's quite a kind of betrayal of everything Bob Dylan had ever said to us, which had always been, you have to find your own salvation in this world. Right back when he was a pop star in '65 and he came to Britain and Pennebaker filmed Don't Look Back. There's a fascinating section of that where he's arguing with he's being interviewed by the guy from Time magazine. And the guy from Time magazine says, "Do you know what your songs are about?" And Dylan, quite rightly, says, "You've got a lot of nerve to ask me a question like that." But then he goes on to say, and this is a 25-year-old being told he's the hippest person on the planet at this point. He's very groovy. He has hit singles. He's the most, there's a whole press conference there hanging on his every word. But when he's talking to the Time magazine guy, he goes on to say, you're going to die, and so am I. We're going to be off the planet, you know, and it could be 20 years or it could be tomorrow. And you know, how seriously you take yourself in the face of that is up to you. So this is an extraordinarily thoughtful young man at a time when most of us would have had our heads turned absolutely, entirely by that kind of level of fame and grooviness. And so when Dylan starts preaching that there's only one authority, instead of you have to find your own salvation in this world, that was difficult, a hard pill to swallow. But obviously, you know, those albums are better than I credited them with. The trouble with writing a book is, you know, you get pinned down as to your assessment, whereas, you know, if you're a living, breathing human being, which I just about still am, you have to be flexible, and you have to recognize that what seems great one day doesn't necessarily seem so great the next, and vice versa. And when you see the footage of something like Dylan in Toronto singing "What Can I Do For You," there's absolutely no doubting his commitment to belief, and also no doubting his skill as a creative artist in rendering that very, very vividly. But also, you know, in terms of the sheer lyrics there, you know, soon as a man is born, you know, the sparks begin to fly, he sings on that "What Can I Do For You." It's an outrageously sort of direct address to God, isn't it? I mean, it might be addressed to Jesus, but that's the same thing, isn't it? And it has a nice line like, soon as a man is born, you know, the sparks begin to fly. It's an even nicer line if you hear underneath it the line he's spinning off from the King James Bible, which is, man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. I mean, that's the level of creativity that he is putting into this stuff. There's nothing casual about it. It's honed writing that any poet would be proud of.
I always wonder, maybe you know, but does this stuff just come to him naturally? Does he work at it? Does he have notebooks where he revises and revises again?
He certainly has notebooks, and he writes things down. And we certainly have, in the case of the notebooks that form his tiptoeing towards Blood on the Tracks in the mid-70s, we have a real demonstration of how much he revises his work, how many phrases are crossed out and changed. Yeah, it's a big part of it. And more recently, when he's more cutting and pasting, he says he has a box with all these quotations in it, and you know, you can pull them out randomly and see what you come up with, and how things may fit together.
What inspires his lyrics? Does he see things randomly? Does he see a billboard or overhear a comment from somebody and say, "Boy, that's interesting"? What inspires him to start to dig into something, a concept or a song?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a compulsion to create. And yes, he could grab it from anywhere at all. You know, in the towards the end of the 50s, there was a very popular hit maker called Dwayne Eddy, who just played a very deep sounding guitar. And one of his best known records was called 40 Miles of Bad Road. And that was just a phrase he had overheard someone say while standing in a line somewhere.
This is a book that I always wonder with all authors, you write a book and then maybe years down the line, you think differently of a certain topic, or in this case,
Exactly.
an album or a song. And one example would be Oh Mercy from 1989. That was that critically acclaimed album that Dylan released. And you originally reviewed it as a great album, but you dilute it to being a fine album in the book. Where do you place it among his 80s catalog? Or what are your overall thoughts on it now as opposed to then?
Yeah, I think it's a fine album. It's not a great album. I mean, obviously, it's possible to find all this labeling and categorizing highly tiresome. What I find tiresome is the people who say, hey, man, it's all just personal judgment, I find that tiresome because it implies that there are no standards at all in art, and that for some weird reason, Leonardo da Vinci and Monet and Rembrandt are considered to be great, whereas I personally, as a guy who lives in Oklahoma and votes for Donald Trump, I personally don't like any of that shit. I find that kind of stuff tiresome, and therefore a certain amount of line drawing has to be made, however many times you may revise where the line is or should be. But, people use words like great far, far too easily in social media, on social media, and in the arts, especially with stuff like rock music, where clearly there are many people who go to a Dylan concert, maybe not so much now that he's in his 80s, but certainly during the huge performance decades of the never-ending tour. People would go, you would hear people standing at the front shouting, Maggie's Farm, rather than being interested in what the artist himself wanted to be performing. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of Yahooism. But on the other hand, I can also see that sometimes one man's very fine album is another man's great album, and what the hell is the difference,
Yeah, you're right, though, about it. They just want to hear the hits. It's like it just dehumanizes the artist. It's like they're a jukebox. And the Beatles went through that towards the end of that run, where they just decided, let's stop touring because nobody's listening to us anyway. They're not even paying attention.
Even hear them.
Yeah.
They couldn't even hear them. They were just, all they could hear was screams.
And as an artist, that just got to be maddening.
Yeah, and I think for Dylan too. I mean, even in more recent years, he's complained about seeing the same old faces in the front rows of his shows. Although if I were Bob Dylan, I'd be more likely to complain about the sort of industry execs and celebs who have acquired their absurdly overpriced VIP seats.
Dylan's 90s work, Volume 3, covers the 90s work, and it includes a defense of Under the Red Sky from 1990 and a reassessment of 1997's Time Out of Mind. Let's start with Under the Red Sky. This is an album, as you write, riddled with nursery rhyme and, to a lesser extent, fairy tale. Talk about why you defend this album. And also there's a song, Handy Dandy, right, is a song that you point out in the book.
Yeah, Handy Dandy. I mean, the chorus is tiresome, okay, Handy Dandy, sugar and candy. But it's a very skillfully written song and a delivery. I mean, one of the things that Dylan has always been very good at is squeezing as many syllables per line into a line as he likes. There'll be one verse of a song where there are 8 syllables in the 4th line. And then the next time the verse comes along, there are 14 syllables in the same line where the tune is the same, the pattern is the same, but Bob can squeeze them in, and often with a deliberate kind of long pause, so that not only is he squeezing them in, but he's giving himself even less time to finish off that squeezing in, because he's left a deliberate long pause where no one else would leave one. It's part of his genius as if you like, it's the sort of jazz end of his spectrum as using his voice as an instrument. The spontaneity, You know, there was a long period where, for example, Memphis Blues Again, he would sing more or less at every concert. And yet, you know, that has a chorus. Oh, Mama, can this really be the end, to be stuck inside a mobile with the Memphis Blues Again? And, you know, in the course of singing that once, he has to sing that line about 5 times. Never once says it exactly the same delivery. You go to a second show and you get 5 more different ways of delivering that line. You know, the range of possibilities is absolutely endless. And yeah, one of the great virtues of a song like Handy Dandy on the Under the Red Sky album is the extraordinary number of syllables that he can fit into those playfully long lines. There's a similar one in Summer Days on Love and Theft, the bit about you can't repeat the past. What do you mean you can't repeat the past? Of course you can, which is squeezed into this much shorter economical amount of space. And Handy Dandy is full of those. There are some very long lines in that song, and he just delights in the way that he brings them off.
I find that interesting, Michael, because I have friends who, there are certain artists that I enjoy listening to that do have a lot of syllables that are all in one verse or one line, and it'll drive them nuts. And I don't see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you know, of course, the old rule remains the case that that you've got to master the form before you can break it. It's no good just coming along as a sort of amateur songwriter, thinking you can throw in as many words in a line as you like. You know, Dylan has mastered all these demands of economy and concentration and all that. And then he can break free of it, as he does with a song like Handy Dandy. I don't have the lyric in front of me and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there are extraordinarily long lines in that song which are just beautifully done. But the other defense of Under the Red Sky is against the idea that because it uses nursery rhyme, therefore it's to be condemned as hopelessly simple. Those people should read a book by Iona and Peter Opie, O-P-I-E, they're both long dead now, about nursery rhymes. Because, you know, there's a great deal of complexity there. And it's not the complexity that people lazily think of, which is that, you know, that ring a roses, pocket full of posies, a tissue will fall down, is somehow a reference to the plague. I mean, that's a myth. That's not true. That's not what matters. What matters about fairy tales and to a lesser extent nursery rhymes is their psychological truth. And for Dylan, you know, of course, he had a grandchild when he made this album, I'm told. And it's partly dedicated to Gabby Goo, and presumably that is the girl who becomes his daughter, Gabrielle. But his use of nursery rhyme is extremely clever on this album. You know, most people know about 6 these days, if they know many at all, but he uses over 30. In other words, he's gone into that genre deeply in the way that he goes into so many other genres. And it produces some very good songs, I think. The title track, Under the Red Sky, is a lovely song.
I did cheat, Michael. I got some lyrics for you from Handy Dandy. I thought I'd read them.
Okay, go on.
Here we go. Here's my favorite, I think. Handy Dandy sitting with a girl named Nancy in a garden, feeling kind of lazy. He says, you want a gun? I'll give you one. She says, boy, you talking crazy.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, really, he fits all that in so beautifully. And a bit at the end, the boy, you're talking crazy. Also, doesn't that remind you of one of those sort of cowboy TV things?
Yeah. Handy Dandy, just like sugar and candy. Handy Dandy, pour him another brandy.
Yeah.
Hey, let's talk Time Out of Mind from 1997, because before I ask about your reassessment of this album, there's this one song, Not Dark Yet, that was immediately moving to me, and it still hits me deep. And speaking of lyrics, I have a lyric from the song. And it's the one that says, I was born here and I'll die here against my will. I know it looks like I'm moving, but I'm standing still. That gets me every time.
Oh, well, that's one of the great songs on the album,
Yes.
Not Dark Yet.
Yes. You have a reassessment of this, right? Your experience, you didn't have that experience upon first listen, but that's changed over time.
Well, when I first heard it, I just thought it's ponderous. And, you know, he's claiming a great seriousness here, a great gravitas, which he does very little to justify. You know, it's, you know, you're not supposed to tell people you're feeling miserable. You're supposed to show them you're feeling miserable. Show, don't tell. I mean, any novelist has to abide by that law if they want to write something with resonance that lasts, you know. And I thought there was far too much of that, Bob being posily dignified about that album. But I recognized all along that there were 4 marvelous songs on it: Not Dark Yet, Standing in the Doorway, and Highlands, and the other one.
Standing in the Doorway is a great one. Yeah, I look at the track list here because that was, I remember at that time, it was somewhat of a quote unquote comeback album for Bob Dylan. That's more of a commercial type of statement, but I mean, it was, and I believe
it was because it was in the aftermath of his interesting heart disease, and you know, he had been completely a figure of the past as far as the media were concerned, even as far as his own record company was concerned, really. I mean, they'd done the 30th anniversary bash for him at in New York in 1992. Quite what that was the 30th anniversary of wasn't clear, but they did. But really, when he was touring in the mid-90s as part of that never-ending tour, the record company didn't even bother to take any notice of where he was. He wasn't selling any records. It did not matter to Sony Records. And then he has this interesting heart disease, and suddenly there are all these media people thinking, oh, maybe he'll die. Maybe Bob Dylan's been a really interesting figure all along. And then he comes out with this album, which you know, has a lot of gravitas and solemnity, and is full of new writing, bags of new writing. So it's a critical success. But you know, part of this is just the weird way media behaves.
And here are the 11 tracks: Lovesick, Dirt Road Blues, Standing in the Doorway, Million Miles, Trying to Get to Heaven, Till I Fell in Love with You, Not Dark Yet, Cold Irons Bound, Make You Feel My Love. That's a great one. I use the word great. Sorry, Michael. Can't Wait. Highlands. Those are the 11 tracks.
Yeah. Actually, I think Make You Feel My Love is the worst song.
Do you? Right.
So there you are.
Yeah, there we go.
And it's, I noticed that it's absolutely the favorite Bob Dylan song of people who don't like Bob Dylan.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Yes. I don't like Bob Dylan's work, but I like some of his songs. I especially like Make You Feel My Love by Adele or by Garth Brooks or whoever. Anybody but Bob.
Yeah. I played it at my wedding. Yeah.
Yes,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
So funny. So you did talk at the front about his most recent work. So we'll finish just getting your thoughts on his recent work, like 2020's Rough and Rowdy Ways, featuring Murder Most Foul, and his most recent album, Shadow Kingdom, which is studio album number 40. Does Bob Dylan still have things left to say and express artistically?
Shadow Kingdom is a weird one because, of course, it's all old songs. Although one of them, and I think it's the best track, the most effective track, is the least old of them all, and that is What Was It You Wanted, which was originally from Oh Mercy. Shadow Kingdom first was presented to us as a sort of TV special that you had to pay for to watch. And then an age goes by and then it becomes a video and an album. And it was billed at the time as Dylan's early songs or something along that line. There's nothing very early, as far as I'm concerned, about a 1988 song from Oh Mercy, like What Was It You Wanted? But basically, most of them were from the 60s or 70s, and a couple of them are very effective indeed. One of them, I think, is Forever Young, because he sounds so patently far away from anything remotely young. And What Was It You Wanted, I think, is a brilliant revisiting of a song without changing the words and yet wholly altering the meaning, which is something Bob has always been good at. I remember him, there were a couple of concerts in the 90s where he did that with Like a Rolling Stone. I mean, even with that song, you know, it had always been scathing and condemnatory and all that. And suddenly you're hearing him quietly pacing the stage and turning it into a sort of soliloquy, a Hamlet soliloquy, where he's addressing himself. Once upon a time, you dressed so fine through the bumps of time in your prime, didn't you? Doesn't change a word, but the tone, the mood, the pace completely changes the meaning of the song. And I think he does that on Shadow Kingdom with What Was It You Wanted? Because on Oh Mercy, the original, that too is quite a sort of derisory song. You might think of it as a sort of Bob Dylan complaint song about always being bugged by people who want things from him, which clearly is the case. It must be extraordinarily difficult to walk around the outside world being Bob Dylan, where people are always rushing up to you and asking you, at the very least, would you sign this, please, if not rather more? And so originally that song, you know, it's sort of, what was it you wanted when you were kissing my cheek? You know, which of course has its own reference to Judas and Jesus and so on. And then when he sings it on Shadow Kingdom as this far older person, it seems to have transformed into a song of genuine confusedness. What was it you wanted? Are you the same person who was here before? Are they playing our song? It's a really beautiful, affecting performance, almost of a person with sort of mild Alzheimer's, you might say. It's his ability to do that, to transform the meaning of one of his own works without changing any word, is yet another of the things that he is so uniquely marvelous at being able to do.
The brand new 3-part 50th anniversary edition of Michael Gray's Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan, is out now through the FM Press. You can find it wherever books are sold. I will have a link to the FM Press's site. All 3 volumes there. You can click the link and buy all 3. And also, you have a website, Michael, right? Because I've seen it. michaelgray.net, I believe.
Yeah, that's it. michaelgray.net, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. We've been emailing back and forth, just trying to make this happen, and it was well worth the wait.
Thank you very much.
That's it. It's in the books.